It was early in the morning when I woke up to the sound of laughter and music drifting through my window. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. But the scent of fresh flowers soon hit me. I rubbed my eyes, thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. I glanced out the window, and my stomach sank. My yard, the private property I had worked so hard to maintain, was transformed into a full-scale wedding venue overnight. Rows of pristine white chairs lined the lawn, leading up to an elegant floral arch. A catering station was set up near the barn. Chefs in crisp white uniforms busy preparing hors d'oeuvres. Near the pond, a string quartet played soft classical music. And at the center of it all, barking orders like she owned the place, was none other than Karen, the Hoa president, who had made it her mission to control every inch of the community, including my property. My boots crunched on the gravel as I stormed outside, my heart pounding with a mix of confusion and anger. This couldn't be happening. As I approached, I saw a massive banner that read, "Welcome to the wedding of Sophia and James." Not a single name I recognized. That's when I knew this wasn't an accident, it was pure entitlement. Karen turned around as I reached the first row of chairs, her face lighting up with fake delight. "Oh, good morning, Jake," she chirped, waving a clipboard at me like she was some benevolent event planner. "Isn't it just gorgeous? The community is going to love this." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, what the hell is this?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. She let out a laugh, her tone light and airy. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a small wedding. We needed the perfect outdoor venue. And honestly, your yard was the best option. You should feel honored. The bride's family is very prestigious. You know." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Karen, this is my land. You can't just throw a wedding here without my permission." She rolled her eyes, flipping through the pages on her clipboard like she was reading from some imaginary rule book. "Oh, don't be silly. The Hoa guidelines allow for community events in appropriate locations." I clenched my fists. For the 100th time, "I'm not part of the Hoa technicalities," she dismissed. "You live here, don't you? That means you should contribute to the community. It's just one day. Stop making a fuss." Before I could respond, the bride and groom approached, looking thrilled to see me. The bride, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, beamed. "Oh, you must be Jake. Thank you so much for letting us use your land. It's breathtaking." "I didn't let you use anything," I snapped, gritting my teeth. "Karen set this up without asking me." The groom, smug in his overpriced suit, chuckled. "Oh, come on, man. No harm, no foul. Right? It's just one day. Besides, we already paid for everything. And the guests are on their way." I ran a hand down my face, feeling my patience slip. "You paid to who?" Karen piped up, her voice dripping with condescension. "To the Hoa, of course. A very reasonable fee, if I do say so myself." My brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of it all. She had not only stolen my property for this event, but she'd also made money off it. "And by the way," Karen added, flipping through her notes, "the catering trucks had trouble parking, so we had them use your driveway. Hope that's not a problem." I turned, and sure enough, my driveway was blocked by multiple vehicles, trucks, vans, even a damn limousine. I couldn't even move my own truck if I needed to leave. My stomach twisted with rage. I took a step forward, lowering my voice so only Karen could hear. "Move it. All of it. Now." Karen scoffed. "Jake, don't be unreasonable. The ceremony starts in an hour. Just go inside and relax. It'll all be over soon." No. Not happening. My land had been taken over. My driveway was blocked. Strangers were trampling my grass. Karen was making money off my property. And now she expected me to relax while a bunch of entitled people pretended my backyard was their venue. I turned and pulled out my phone. "Hey," I said when my farmhand picked up. "Open the back gate and let them out." There was a pause. "All of them?" I glanced at Karen, now happily chatting with some Hoa members, oblivious to what was coming. "Every single one." My farmhand laughed. "Got it, boss." I slipped my phone back in my pocket and strolled over to the buffet table, casually grabbing a shrimp skewer. If they wanted a wedding in my yard, they were about to get a real farm experience. Jake leaned against the buffet table, calmly chewing on a shrimp skewer, as Karen basked in the attention of arriving guests. She flitted through the crowd like a self-appointed queen, shaking hands, offering fake laughs, and acting like she owned the land beneath her feet. The bride and groom, caught up in last-minute wedding preparations, were oblivious to the fact that they were essentially trespassing on someone else's property. Jake's eyes flicked toward the barn in the distance. He knew what was coming. His farmhand had already opened the back gate, and the anticipation sent a spark of satisfaction through him. The chaos that was about to unfold would be perfect. The guests had no idea that their perfectly curated event was about to turn into pure pandemonium. The first sign of trouble came when the caterers near the barn suddenly froze. One of them, a man in a chef's coat and black cap, pointed toward the open gate with wide eyes. A deep moo echoed across the yard, followed by the heavy thud of hooves against the grass. Jake took another bite of shrimp. Showtime. A wave of cows came charging through the open gate. Their large bodies moved with surprising speed for creatures their size. Some were lazily chewing hay, while others seemed excited by their newfound freedom. But it was Diesel, Jake's particularly feisty bull, that had its eyes locked onto the towering wedding cake near the buffet. It was already on a direct collision course with the dessert. The chaos was instantaneous. Guests screamed as cows barreled through the seating area, knocking over chairs and sending delicate floral arrangements flying through the air. The bride shrieked in horror as Diesel made direct contact with the cake, smashing it into a pile of ruined frosting and crushed layers. The groom jumped back just in time to avoid getting splattered, but his pristine white suit was already dusted with dirt from the cows kicking up the grass. Karen's face went through several rapid changes: confusion, shock, and then absolute rage. She whirled toward Jake, her voice shrill. "What did you do?" Jake wiped his mouth with a napkin and tossed the skewer into the mess Diesel had made. "Huh. Looks like my cows didn't get the wedding invite. Guess they wanted to crash the party." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her brain clearly trying to comprehend the sudden chaos. She turned back toward the wedding disaster unfolding around her. A group of older guests were frantically trying to escape the chaos, but one cow had decided to make itself comfortable near the exit, effectively blocking the way. Another guest had the misfortune of stepping directly into a fresh pile of manure, his expensive shoes ruined. Then came the goats, smaller, faster, and infinitely more mischievous. They darted through the yard with wild enthusiasm. One goat leapt onto the gift table, sending neatly wrapped presents flying in all directions. Another managed to climb onto the DJ's sound system, its little hooves stomping all over the controls, causing the classical wedding music to warp into an unholy mix of distorted sounds. And then there was Sergeant Honkers, Jake's favorite troublemaker. The big white goose wasn't about to miss the action. It took one look at the chaos and decided to establish dominance with a loud, aggressive honk. Flapping its wings, it charged toward the nearest victim, the groom. The groom let out a strangled yelp as Sergeant Honkers nipped at his leg, flapping wildly in what could only be described as a one-sided battle for territory. The bride, in absolute distress, tried to pull the goose away, but that only made Sergeant Honkers angrier. It honked again, flapping at the bride as she shrieked, trying to defend herself. Jake watched the spectacle with growing satisfaction. The whole event had become a disaster, a full-blown farmyard frenzy, and Karen had no idea what hit her. "Call them off," she screamed, hands flailing in the air. Jake smirked, taking his time before replying. "They live here. You're the one trespassing. The guests were in full panic mode now. Some had climbed onto chairs to avoid the cows. A group of bridesmaids had taken shelter behind the catering table, peering out in horror as a particularly curious goat chewed on the hem of their dresses. One older gentleman had taken a defensive stance against Sergeant Honkers, waving a napkin in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. Meanwhile, Karen was caught in the middle of it all, trying to salvage whatever was left of her so-called event. "Everyone, please remain calm," she shouted. But it was clear that no one was listening. The cows were still wandering freely, munching on flowers and decor, while the goats had completely taken over the buffet table. Karen's control over the situation had crumbled completely. Her pristine wedding was now a field of chaos. "I'm calling the police," she shrieked. Jake leaned back against the buffet table, his arms crossed. "Oh, please do. I'd love to see how they handle an unauthorized wedding on private property." As the sirens in the distance grew louder, Jake grinned. He had turned the tables in the best way possible. Karen's wedding had gone from elegant to an absolute mess, and he couldn't be more pleased. The wedding had been completely destroyed. Guests scrambled to clean themselves off, some running for their cars in panic, while others stood frozen, too stunned to move. The sound of hooves and bleating goats still echoed in the background as Karen stood in the center of the wreckage, a vision of absolute frustration. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling faster than she could control, and the weight of her humiliation was evident in the tightness of her clenched jaw. "Call the police, now," she screamed, her voice filled with a frantic desperation. Jake watched, leaning casually against the fence, a small grin tugging at his lips. He was enjoying this far more than he probably should have. But Karen had pushed him too far. She had taken over his property without permission, and now, she was reaping the consequences. Within minutes, the wail of sirens could be heard in the distance, and soon enough, two uniformed officers pulled up in their patrol car. They stepped out and surveyed the absolute chaos unfolding before them. One officer adjusted his hat as the other pulled out a notepad, clearly preparing to document the disaster. Karen, ever the one to try and control a situation, rushed over to them. "Officers," she called out, waving her hands frantically, "you need to arrest him. He's the one who did this. He let his animals loose. They destroyed everything." Jake could see it, the moment Karen realized she had lost. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her face turned a shade of red that matched her growing panic. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. "I built this Hoa," Karen finally spat, standing up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. "I've kept it running for years." Another voice from the back of the room spoke up, filled with bitterness. "You've abused your position for years. You've fined people for nothing, made up rules, and now you've cost us all thousands of dollars because of your mistakes. It's over." The room fell silent. Everyone knew it was true. Karen had pushed too far, and now, no one was willing to protect her anymore. The bald man cleared his throat again, his expression hardening. "We have enough votes. It's official. Karen, you're removed from your position as Hoa president. You have 1 week to vacate your role." Karen's face was ashen, her hands trembling. She looked as if she might collapse right there. But instead, she forced herself to straighten up. Without a word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind her. Jake let out a low whistle, enjoying the moment. "Well," he muttered to himself, "that was fun." The room let out a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in years, it felt like the Hoa might actually be in good hands. Jake turned to leave, but just before he reached the door, the bald man called after him. "Jake," he said, giving him a nod of appreciation. "Thanks for everything. You've done what we couldn't." Jake smirked and gave him a nod in return. "Don't thank me. Thank my cows." As the meeting wound down, Jake walked out of the clubhouse, already feeling the weight of the neighborhood lift. Karen's reign of terror was over. And it was about time. In the days that followed Karen's removal from her position as Hoa president, the once proud woman seemed to shrink before the eyes of the community. The high and mighty Karen, who had ruled with an iron fist, was now a shadow of her former self. News of her ousting spread quickly, and soon, everyone knew that the woman who had made their lives miserable for so long was no longer in charge. But the consequences of her actions didn't stop with losing her position in the Hoa. Word had gotten out about the unauthorized wedding she had organized on Jake's land, and the families involved were furious. The bride's family, who had paid the Hoa for the venue, filed a lawsuit for damages. The financial cost of the ruined wedding, the property damage, and the emotional distress was immense. They demanded compensation for the disaster she had caused. As Karen's protests grew more frantic, the officers motioned for her to step aside. They began speaking with the guests, who had gathered in small clusters, recounting their stories and providing receipts of payment to the Hoa. The scene unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Karen, once the towering figure in the neighborhood, was now being exposed for her greed, her lies, and her complete disregard for the law. Jake couldn't help but watch with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. He had known from the start that Karen wouldn't stop at just taking over his land, she would try to cover it all up. And now, she was paying the price for it. The officers led Karen away, her protests turning into frantic screeches as they escorted her to their patrol car. One officer, trying to keep his composure, glanced at Jake. "I think we'll be seeing her in court," he said with a hint of disbelief. "You're lucky she didn't get her way this time." Jake leaned back against the fence, crossing his arms. "Yeah. I think it's time the neighborhood learned that no one gets to mess with my property, not even Karen." As the police car drove off, the rest of the guests slowly began to gather their things, still shaken by the madness they'd witnessed. The bride, wiping mascara streaks from her face, gave Jake a wary look. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I'm sorry about all this." Jake gave her a small nod, his voice calm. "Next time, double-check who actually owns the venue before paying." She offered him a small smile, before turning to leave with her family. The groom, still brushing hay from his suit, gave Jake a frustrated look but said nothing. As the last of the guests filed out, Jake watched the police car fade into the distance, and for the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace. The chaos had ended, and with it, Karen's reign of control. The next few days after the wedding disaster were filled with whispers and murmurs throughout the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, as it always does in tight-knit communities, and soon everyone knew about the debacle that had unfolded on Jake's property. The event that Karen had orchestrated, without permission, had turned into a complete failure, and her lies were laid bare for all to see. Jake wasn't surprised when he received a message later that evening. It was an emergency Hoa meeting, called to address the fallout from Karen's actions. He wasn't officially a part of the Hoa, but after everything that had happened, Jake couldn't resist the opportunity to witness Karen's downfall firsthand. When he arrived at the clubhouse that night, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The usual polite murmurings were replaced with angry glares and whispered arguments. The chairs were set in a circle, but the air felt like it was about to snap. Karen sat at the center, her posture stiff, her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair as if she could hold on to her position by sheer force of will. Jake stood by the door, arms crossed, silently watching the drama unfold. One of the older board members, a man with a bald head and sharp eyes, stood up and cleared his throat. "All right, let's get down to business," he began, his voice firm but not without a trace of exasperation. "We all saw what happened at that wedding. We all know who was responsible for it." Karen straightened in her chair, forcing a smile. "Yes. And I think we need to discuss the real problem here, Jake's complete disregard for community standards. His animals caused a scene, Karen." The bald man cut her off, his voice rising. "We're not here to talk about Jake. We're here to talk about you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The once loyal supporters of Karen were now looking at her with growing skepticism. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others sat back, clearly disillusioned by their leader. Karen's smile faltered, but she didn't back down. "I don't understand," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "I did what was best for the community. The wedding was an important event, it brought prestige to our neighborhood." "Prestige?" One of the women sitting near the front scoffed. "You lied to everyone, stole money, and nearly got us all sued. That's not best for the community. Karen, that's reckless." The murmurs grew louder. Karen's grip on the table tightened as if she were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "You all don't understand. I was thinking of the greater good. The bride's family." "Don't give us that," another man interrupted, shaking his head. "We're all paying the price for your arrogance. Now we're in legal trouble because of it." Jake couldn't help but smirk. This was it, the moment Karen's empire was crumbling. An older man with glasses, who had been silent up until now, stood up. "There have been discussions," he said gravely, "and we need to vote on this. It's clear that Karen has abused her power, and the situation has become untenable." Karen's face went pale. "A vote?" she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "You can't be serious." The bald man nodded. "Yes, Karen. A vote to remove you from your position as Hoa president. The rest of us have had enough." Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for someone, anyone, who would stand by her side. But the looks she received were cold, even from the people who had once been her allies. One by one, they raised their hands, signaling their agreement. The once unshakable hold she had on the Hoa board was slipping through her fingers. Jake couldn't help but smirk at her. "Oh, I didn't do anything. My animals are just doing what they do. It's not my fault you decided to host a wedding on someone else's property without asking." The officers exchanged a look, then turned their attention to Jake. One officer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward and addressed him. "So, this is your property?" he asked, pointing to the wreckage. Jake nodded, crossing his arms. "Yeah. And no, I didn't give permission for any wedding to be held here." Karen, now visibly panicked, tried to interject, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "But he's lying. The Hoa gave us permission." Excuse me, ma'am," the officer interrupted, cutting her off. "You're saying the Hoa gave permission for an event here?" "Of course." Karen's face was flushed with frustration. "They're part of the community. He's just being difficult. I told everyone this was all arranged." The officer turned to the other, raising an eyebrow. "Is that so?" he asked, clearly skeptical. Turning back to Jake, he continued, "You're saying you never gave permission for any event here?" Jake shook his head. "Nope. I don't belong to the Hoa. Never have. Never will. And I sure as hell didn't sign off on a wedding happening on my land." The other officer, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "And you didn't receive any official request or communication from the Hoa about this event?" "None," Jake answered, his tone firm. The officers exchanged another look before the first officer spoke again, addressing Karen this time. "Ma'am, it looks like you may have misled these folks. They've paid the Hoa for a venue that doesn't belong to the Hoa. You didn't have permission to use this property for this event." Karen's eyes widened in horror. She opened her mouth to argue but closed it again when she realized there was no escape. The truth had been laid bare. The second officer stepped forward, pulling out his notepad. "We'll need to look into this further. But from what we're seeing, this wedding was unauthorized and, frankly, a waste of public resources. You're facing some serious questions here." Karen's face drained of color. The weight of her lies, the fraud, and the chaos she had caused were all coming to a head. "But, I didn't," she began. But the words failed her. "We'll be in touch, ma'am," the officer said firmly, his tone no longer sympathetic. right now. We need to get your side of things on record." Karen was left scrambling, unable to keep up with the mounting legal pressure. She had assumed that her position as Hoa president would protect her. But now, without the influence she once wielded, she was just another individual facing the full force of the law. Meanwhile, Jake received a check from the bride's family. It was a generous sum meant to cover the costs of the damage to his land, the lost time, and the expenses incurred during the chaos of the wedding. He didn't need the money, it wasn't about that. It was the principle. Karen had taken what didn't belong to her, and now, she was paying the price. As Jake reviewed the check, he couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. He had fought for his property, his rights, and his peace of mind. And now he had seen Karen's reign of terror come to a crashing halt. But the money was just a small victory compared to what had happened to Karen. The community, once living in fear of her arbitrary fines and ridiculous rules, began to breathe easier. Without Karen's constant interference, people started working together, and the neighborhood began to change for the better. It was as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Karen, on the other hand, had no one left to turn to. The Hoa members who had once been her loyal supporters now avoided her. She was ostracized, no longer able to manipulate the system she had once controlled. Her name became synonymous with failure, and her reputation lay in tatters. The very people she had mistreated for so long now saw her for what she truly was, a power-hungry fraud who had overplayed her hand. As the months passed, Karen's life seemed to fall apart. The lawsuits piled up, and the financial burden became too much to bear. She was forced to sell her house and move out of the neighborhood that she had once dominated. The once feared Hoa president had become a mere memory, a cautionary tale whispered about by those who had lived through her tyranny. For Jake, life slowly returned to normal. His farm was his again, free from the shadow of Karen's overbearing control. He'd learned a valuable lesson about standing up for what was right, and he would never let anyone take advantage of him or his property again. As for Karen, she was left with nothing but the ruins of her own making. Her power, her reputation, and her wealth had all been stripped away. In the end, it was clear, there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Jake glanced down at the check one last time and chuckled softly to himself. "Karma's a funny thing," he muttered, tucking it into his pocket. "But it sure feels good when it comes around." And there you have it, Karen's reign of terror finally came to an end, and justice prevailed. What do you think about the way Jake handled the situation? Do you think Karen got what she deserved? Or do you feel there should have been a different outcome? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to hear more crazy Hoa drama, subscribe and turn on the notifications so you never miss an update from Hoa Karen stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.